On the same day, from the same government, you heard all of these lines. This is not about regime change. Come into the streets. This is not really a war. We are going to finish it. That is where this story begins. Not with a missile map, not with a bunker buster, not with some dramatic battle sequence, with the most dangerous sign any country can give off in the middle of a war. It cannot explain in one straight sentence what victory actually means. That is the real crisis here. Because the real story is not whether the United States can destroy more of Iran. Of course it can destroy more of Iran. The real story is that Washington still cannot tell you what political condition would allow it to say honestly and in public that the war has been won. And once a war loses that sentence, everything else starts to. That is why one line from the source matters more than almost everything else in the file. The United States cannot win this war in any meaningful way. Iran only has to survive. If that line is true, then the whole structure of the conflict changes. Then every American strike becomes easier to understand and harder to justify at the same time. Then every promise from the White House sounds less like strategy and more like noise covering a vacuum. Then every additional week helps the side with the simpler objective. And Iran's objective is brutally simple. Do not die politically. Do not collapse. Do not disappear. That is enough. This is why I think the war is much more dangerous than it looks on television. Most coverage still treats the problem as if it were basically military. Can American air power destroy enough targets? Can Israeli operations keep pressure on the regime? Can enough launchers be eliminated? Can enough enrichment capacity be hit? Those questions matter, but they are not the central questions. The central question is political. What exact end state is America trying to produce? Not a slogan, not a justification of the day. An actual end state, a real war, you have to be able to describe the condition on the ground that would allow you to say the war achieved its purpose. If you cannot define that condition, you are not pursuing a real strategy. You are pursuing motion. And motion, once bombs are falling, is one of the most dangerous things in politics. Look at the pattern. One day, the war is about nuclear enrichment. The next day, it is about ballistic missiles. Then it becomes about defending Israel. Then it becomes about long-term regional order. Then it drifts openly toward regime change. Then someone rushes out to say it is not about regime change. Then the president tells the Iranian people to rise. That is not flexibility. That is strategic incoherence. And that incoherence is not a side issue. It is the whole issue. Because if you strip away the public slogans and look at the logic underneath them, everything keeps collapsing back onto the same hidden center regime change. Destroy the missiles. If the regime survives, it rebuilds them. Destroy the drones. If the regime survives, it rebuilds them. Destroy the enrichment facilities. If the regime survives, it rebuilds them. Destroy the network tying Tehran to Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis. If the regime survives, it rebuilds those relationships too. That is the point. Nobody in Washington wants to say plainly. None of the public goals make durable sense unless the regime itself changes. That means regime change is not one option among many. It is the hidden requirement holding the rest of the argument together. And the moment you say that out loud, the whole structure starts to fall apart because now you need two answers that Washington simply does not have. Can you actually get regime change? And if you get it, what replaces it? Let us start with the first one. Can the United States and Israel break the regime from the air without boots on the ground in a way that produces real political collapse and not just extraordinary destruction? I do not see a plausible story. Air power can destroy targets. It cannot automatically manufacture a new political order. In fact, under conditions like these, it often does the opposite of what its advocates promise. A regime facing what it believes is an existential threat does not usually become soft. It centralizes, it hardens, it turns survival into ideology. It tells its elites and its institutions that the only alternatives are victory or annihilation. That does not weaken the political core. It tends to compress it. Now suppose, for the sake of argument, that somehow the regime does start breaking. Then who governs Iran? Who restores order? Who commands the pieces of the state that remain? Who stops factional violence, military fragmentation, regional spillover, and internal revenge cycles. Who is the organized pro-American force inside Iran waiting to take power and then deliver the strategic outcome Washington claims it wants? There's no serious answer, and that is why the conversation keeps drifting toward fantasies. The moment people start talking about exile figures as if they are ready-made post-war governments, they are not offering a plan, they are confessing that they do not have one. A post-war state is not a surname. It is not a family memory. It is not nostalgia. It is an actual internal structure with legitimacy, coercive ability, bureaucratic depth, and some believable relationship to the society. It is meant to rule. That does not exist here. And that is why the war feels less and less like design and more like momentum. That would already be dangerous enough. Now add the military reality. There has been too much loose talk about Iran being finished. No, Iran is damaged. Iran is degraded. Iran is under enormous pressure. But degraded is not the same thing as gone. A state does not need full capability to keep a war strategically dangerous. It only needs enough surviving capability to deny the stronger side a clean political ending. Iran still has that. Enough missiles, enough drones, enough launch capacity, enough geography, enough hardened intent, enough regional pressure points, enough to keep making the stronger side spend. That is the real battlefield. Now, Washington still talks as if the decisive variable is how much damage it can impose. The more important variable is whether damage can be turned into a believable political result before the war becomes too expensive, too open-ended, and too incoherent to sustain. That is why the inventory problem matters so much. The United States does not have unlimited weapons. That is not a matter of opinion. It is an industrial fact. We already learned from Ukraine that stockpiles draw down production lags, and long wars expose limits that short wars can hide. Now add another major consuming war in the Middle East, while the strategic establishment keeps talking every day about China in East Asia. That is not strategic comfort. That is strategic compression. And compression is exactly the condition a weaker enemy can exploit. Iran does not need a grand battlefield victory. It does not need to drive American forces into the sea. It does not need to defeat Washington in some cinematic sense. It only needs to survive while continuing to impose cost. Cost on munitions, cost on logistics, cost on credibility, cost on Gulf stability, cost on shipping, cost on politics. That is enough. That is the real Iranian victory condition, survival. Once you understand that, the war stops looking like a story about whether America is strong enough. It becomes a story about whether American strength can ever produce the political future it claims to want. And here's where the deepest irony appears. The more Washington escalates without a believable end state, the more it may be teaching Tehran the one lesson it never wanted Tehran to learn fully: survival without a nuclear deterrent is too dangerous. A war that was sold partly as preventing future danger may be manufacturing a much stronger, long-run incentive for that danger to come back in a more serious form later. That is not a small side effect. That is a strategic disaster waiting to mature. Now add the escalation ladder. This is where the confident talk from Washington becomes almost surreal. If Tehran concludes this war is not about bargaining but about extinction, then it stops calculating like a state trying to preserve room for compromise. It starts calculating like a state deciding how much damage it can still spread before the end. That means Gulf energy. That means ports. That means desalination. That means shipping. That means Hormuz not as leverage, but as a wound. That is the true nightmare sitting behind all of this. The administration keeps speaking as if escalation is a staircase it owns. It does not. Both sides are on that staircase, and one side only needs to decide that normal restraint no longer matters. That is why the rhetoric sounds so absurd. This is not really a war. We are finishing it. It is limited. We are setting the terms. Those are not signs of control. They are signs of a political class trying to talk its way around the fact that it entered a war before answering the one question that mattered most. What does victory look like? Washington, that is why this war feels less like a strategy than a trap. A war whose meaningful victory condition does not exist. A war whose hidden center is regime change. A war whose regime change path is implausible. A war whose enemy still retains enough capability to keep making the stronger side pay. A war whose continuation deepens the very contradictions that made the war incoherent in the first place. That is not a design, that is momentum with explosives. And if you compress the whole thing into one hard line, it is this. America can keep dropping bombs, it still cannot drop an ending.